All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome back. We're continuing our consideration of the Gospel of Luke, a gospel of friendship, and we're in Luke chapter 20, and our theme is around this idea of for all live unto him. And this chapter or this section, and in some ways we've been working on a chapter by chapter basis, just because it's convenient. But if we say chapter or section, I hope you'll humor me that the chapters are artificial, and so therefore the break is not strongly linked to the chapter solely. Is a chapter where, in some ways, we're bringing a whole bunch of thoughts together that Luke has presented to Theophilus and to us, and then we're transitioning into these final sort of days of the Lord Jesus Christ's life in his first advent. And so it's a pivotal chapter in that sense, and it pulls a whole lot of thoughts together. And hopefully we can sort of see how it's rounding off some thoughts and then opening it up to new thoughts. And a lot of it revolves around the location of the events. We know that the events have been in houses, and there's a transition that is introduced in this chapter or the end of the previous chapter and into this chapter and then into the next chapter, which is designed to develop in us a transition as well. And so hopefully we can see that. But this idea of for all live unto him, and what does that actually look like and mean to us? So our goal is to look at this summation of this chapter and what is it really all about, and how does it tie off all these thoughts is what we're intending for this evening. Now, having said that, can we go to Luke chapter 19 and come in at verse 41? Because as we said, that the transition is artificial. The chapter, sorry, is artificial. The break there. Now, if you're in Luke 19, on the screen there, we see that Luke 19 brings a whole package of thoughts. It was introduced in chapter 13, and then it comes back in at chapter 19, and we saw those bookends. So the triumphant entry is at the end of Luke 13, and here at the end of chapter 19, we see the triumphant entry fulfilled. So it's prophesied and then it's fulfilled. We also saw that daughter of Abraham and son of Abraham, and all this talk around children of Abraham is also tied up in the chapters that sit between 13 and 19. So, we're rounding off this section of thought, and then we're going to be moving into something different, as it were, something new, something that goes beyond what is here, but is also been a thread that was started in the very early chapters of Luke, and we'll see that in our next study, how he's bringing us back to where he started. And so the first few chapters of Luke and the last few chapters are bookends in themselves, and this chapter 20, is sort of a pivotal point, a transition point. So we're sort of down here at this orange where we've come to the triumphant entry. And then in Luke chapter 19, verse 41, you can see it says, and when he was come near, he beheld the city and wept over it. Now, this weeping over the city is also connected back to chapter 13. So chapter 13, when he prophesies about the triumphant entry, we get a connection to these thoughts as well. And so what we've got to remember is that it's a flow of thought, and the chapter break in some ways doesn't help us any, but it's just convenient. So he comes near to the city and he weeps over it, and then in verse 45 we get a new in the sense he hasn't come to this setting in some time in his gospel account. In verse 45 it says, and he went into the temple. So we've gone through Jericho, we've come near unto the city of Jerusalem, and now he's going to go into the temple. And so with this new location comes a new set of thoughts. And that's where we want to pick up, is essentially verse 45, and look at how those thoughts flow through the next chapter and the chapter that follows. So he says there in verse 46 of chapter 19, after seeing those who sold and bought in the temple, and he says, "It is written, my house is a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves." Now, this is a quote from a previous section of scripture, because we've got that indication, it is written. Now, I just want you to, we've been talking about chapter 19 here and how it corresponds with chapter 13. Can you just bring your, put your finger there for a moment and just come back to chapter 13 and look at how chapter 13 ends, and you'll see that this idea of the house and a different type of house is being spoken of. So in Luke chapter 13 and verse 34 and 35, it says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, which killeth the prophets and stoneth them that are sent unto thee, how often I would have gathered thy children together as a hen doth gather her brood under her wings, and you would not. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. Verily I say unto you, you shall not see me until that time when that time come, when you shall say, Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord." And there's that triumphant entry prophesied. The things that we see that correspond, besides the triumphant entry, is that when he came near the city in chapter 13, he has this sort of weeping moment. And here in chapter 19, we saw in verse 41 that he wept over it. And he have a similar sentiment between the two chapters. But there's a difference in the sense that they both speak of house. But notice in chapter 13, it says, "Behold, your house is left unto you desolate." And in this chapter, it's, "My house is a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves." And so we've got a contrast between the two houses. The house of God, which should be a house of prayer, and their house, a house that's going to become desolate because it's a den, it's a cave, as it were, for thieves and robbers. And so what was supposed to be a house for God, a place for him to dwell, has now gone from a house of prayer to a den of thieves, or a desolate house. And so we see a transition between these two houses. And then if you come back to chapter 19, you'll see that it says, "And he taught daily in the temple." So he's there in the temple, and he's trying to instill in these people the idea of what the temple of God ought to be. What is this house supposed to be, and the cost that is associated with it? If you're back in Luke chapter 19, you'll see that then in verse 20 it says, "And it came to pass that on one of those days, as he taught the people in the temple." So you can see that in the chapter that we're supposed to be considering, the location is the temple. And it's described for us initially here in chapter 19 as a house of prayer. Now you'll see that the quote in the middle of the screen there is Isaiah 56. Come back to Isaiah 56 for a moment. And I think one of the challenges that we have when we look at Bible passages is that we have a tendency to go, oh, okay, so it's Isaiah 56 verse 7. There's the house of prayer, and ta-da, tick. That's where it's written. But that's never the intention for us to go and find our passage as in one verse, because again, the verses are artificial. We're supposed to go and find where this is spoken of and read what is contained in the whole of it. And I think we lose out and we miss so much of the punch when we just go and grab that one verse. And so if you're in Isaiah 56, just come back to verse 1. Now, we're not going to go beyond 56 because of our time constraints. But again, I'd encourage you to read more broadly than just 56 and the verses we consider tonight, and just see how the message ripples out, and the layers upon layers of intention and focus and the power of it is so much more pregnant in its meaning when we look more broadly than just that one verse. So all we're going to do is look at about 8 verses here, but just look at how that sits, because Luke could go anywhere. Luke has the opportunity to include this passage about my house is a house of prayer, but you've made it a den of thieves, or not include it at all. And for some reason, he's chosen to take us here. It's not like, oh, well, Jesus said this, so I've got to use it, because there's plenty of things that Jesus says that aren't used. So why use this, and why draw our attention back to here? So Isaiah 56, verse 1, thus saith the Lord, keep ye judgment and do justice, for my salvation is near to come, and my righteousness to be revealed. Now, remember what we saw in the chapters leading up to this is this focus on nearness and nigh. In Luke's gospel, he drew nigh, he came near, his proximity is key to those verses. And here we've got a reference back into the Old Testament, which also says salvation is coming near and is about to be revealed. Blessed is the man that doeth this, and the Son of Man that layeth hold on it, that keepeth the Sabbath from polluting it, and keepeth his hands from doing evil. Now, we wouldn't necessarily see much as a direct link to that, but obviously that's not what was happening when Jesus came into the temple and he saw people buying and selling. They weren't seeing this as something that was sacred. But if we read on, verse 3, neither let the son of the stranger. Now that has a link to Theophilus and Luke's gospel, and it has a link to us. We are strangers, or we're strangers and aliens from the hope of Israel. And now we've been brought nigh. Paul uses that expression in Ephesians. And so you can see again that there's a flow of thought about this idea of nearness and nigh, and the connection to the stranger, to the Gentile. Neither let the son of the stranger that hath joined himself to the Lord speak, saying, the Lord hath utterly separated me from his people. Neither let the eunuch say, behold, I am a dry tree. For thus saith the Lord unto the eunuchs that keep my Sabbath, and choose the things that please me, and take hold of my covenant. Even unto them will I give in my house. So you see, again, the reference to mine. Yeah, this is my house, mine house. And within my walls, a place better than the names of sons and of daughters. Now, again, think of where we've heard sons and daughters in Luke's gospel. A better name than sons and daughters. A better name of sons and daughters of who? Well, to the Jew, the only descendant, the only child that was of any importance was the child of promise, the child of Abraham. And here we have Luke in chapter 13 and then in chapter 19 talking about sons and daughters of Abraham. And then we had that peculiar parable in Luke chapter 16 about Abraham's bosom and the rich man who called Abraham his father. And Abraham referred to the rich man as my son. And here it's saying, well, the person who keeps the Sabbath is going to have a better name than that. And so you can see these flow-ons of thought before we even get to the quote we're looking for in verse 7. Interestingly, back in verse 3 there, where it talks about this idea of the stranger who's joined himself to the Lord, where do we get that idea of joined? You know, when we think about being joined to the Lord, was that not the description of the tribe of Levi? That when the tribe of Levi became ministers, for example, Numbers 18, I think, yeah, Numbers 18 verses 2 and 4 is a good place as any. It talks about how the tribe of Levi was joined to the Lord. And so here we've got the stranger being offered, in a sense, a priestly role, who doesn't even have a hope of being part of the covenants of promise, let alone being a minister of the covenant of promise as a priest. And yet this is what's been extended. This is what's been placed on offer. And you imagine how Theophilus would have felt reading these words and going, whoa, there's a lot more here on offer than meets the eye. If we come down to where we left off, he comes back to the stranger. So a better name than sons, and I will give him an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. Verse 6. Also the sons of the stranger that join themselves to the Lord. There again, you've got that word join, and it's deliberate. We had it in the previous verse, and then we come back to strangers, and it's again a joining. And we should be sitting there thinking, oh, you know, isn't this interesting? We've got these ideas, and then when we think about Luke's gospel, where we started way back all that time ago, Luke introduces his gospel with the priest in a temple, standing before the veil, doing the priest's office, it says. He was one who was joined to the Lord. And here now we're coming back to those ideas of what it actually means to be a child of Abraham, what does actually constitute a stranger and what is not a stranger. And here we've got people who would join themselves to the Lord to serve him and to love the name of the Lord, to be his servants. And again, focus on that word servants, because we saw that in the chapters leading up to where we are. Everyone that keepeth the Sabbath from polluting it and taking hold of my covenant, even them will I bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be accepted upon mine altar, for my house shall be called the house of prayer for who? Do you see? There's the punch. For all people. Again, you know, once you start reading it in its context, it's not just, you know, my house is to be called a house of prayer, and you've made it a den of robbers. It's a house of prayer for all people. Boom, and it comes and leaps off its page and grabs us. And you imagine Theophilus would have read that and gone, for all people. For the Lord God, which gathereth the outcasts of Israel, saith, yet will I gather others to him besides those that are gathered unto him. You can see now that, like, we've just taken those first 8 verses and we haven't even bothered to go any further. And we just see how powerful that reference back, when he says it is written, it's a deliberate thing to say, go back. You go and find Isaiah 56 and you read that, Theophilus, and you embrace all that it says about what a stranger who joins himself to the Lord, what is on offer there, and how does, if that allusion to a stranger who's joined is an allusion to the priesthood, how does that happen? How does anyone become a priest who is not from the tribe of Levi? And I want you to just hold that in the back of your head, because when we get back to Luke, we're going to see that, again, we come back to these ideas, that it's not he's just left us there, or he's off onto another thought, and there's no connections between these events in Luke chapter 20, that there's a deliberate argument and a presentation of thought that's leading us to a conclusion, because Theophilus is supposed to walk away better instructed, more confident in his faith than he had been prior to reading this gospel. Now, boy, that took a lot of time. And no wonder we just read verse 7 and go, yep, tick, we're done. Come over to Jeremiah chapter 7, because this is the other half of this quote. Essentially, he's quoting from Isaiah 56 when he says a house of prayer. And then he's going to say, but you've made it a den of robbers. And we go, well, where is this den of robbers? That's in Jeremiah chapter 7. So if we go over to Jeremiah chapter 7, the quote at the bottom of the screen, you'll see that in verse 11, he's got den of robbers. And we could be content with that and go, yep, there's our quote. Is this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes? Behold, even I have seen it, saith the Lord. But you know full well that if we were to go here, that we're supposed to read more than what's just there. Come back to the start of this chapter, and we won't go verse by verse because I think we'll run out of time. But if you come back to chapter 7 and verse 1, you'll see in where the Lord comes to Jeremiah, verse 2, stand in the gate of the Lord's house. So the context or the setting of these words that Jeremiah is going to proclaim are in the gate of the Lord's house. And again, you could take this and look at Ezekiel, and we talked about the glory of the Lord being departed, and the glory of the Lord returning in Ezekiel. And you can think about what it says about the gate of the Lord's house and this location. But stand in the gate of the Lord's house. It's not their house, it's the Lord's house. And proclaim there this word and say, hear the word of the Lord, all ye of Judah, that enter in at these gates to worship the Lord. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, amend your ways and your doings, and I will cause you to dwell in this place. Trust ye not in lying words, saying, now look at how powerful this passage is. The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these. You can see that in taking us back to Jeremiah chapter 7, the question is, what temple or house for the Lord are we? And what makes up the house? And that's consistent with Isaiah's message, because you know Isaiah as well as I, that Isaiah chapter 1 starts off with a house that is leprous. The whole body is sick and the whole of the house is sick. And here we've got people who claim to be the temple of the Lord, claim it and repeatedly chant that they're the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, and yet they trust in lying words, and they've made this house a house of a den of robbers, and that it's going to be a house it's made desolate. And so we've got this warning in verse 5 again. For if ye thoroughly amend your ways and your doings, if you thoroughly execute judgment between a man and his neighbor, if you oppress not, now look at the characters here. Is this not a summation of the characters or the individuals that Luke has chosen to focus on throughout his gospel? If you oppress not the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, and shed not innocent blood in this place, neither walk after other gods to your hurt, then I will cause you to dwell in this place, in the land that I gave to your fathers forever and ever. Behold, ye trust in lying words that cannot profit. Will ye steal, murder, and commit adultery, and swear falsely, and burn incense unto Baal, and walk after other gods whom ye know not, and come and stand before me? Now that word before there is in the face. That's the Hebrew word face. And come and stand in my face in this house, which is called by who? By my name, and say, we are delivered to do all these abominations. Is this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes? Behold, I have seen it, saith the Lord. Think about how powerful that is in light of where we are in Luke chapter 20 or Luke chapter 19. on the verge of chapter 20. This is what Christ is saying, and these are the passages that Luke is bringing us back to consider. And if we were in any doubt that there's these, bigger links to it, you'll notice that here in Jeremiah chapter 7, he makes references to the 10 Commandments essentially in verse 9, where you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, burn incense to Baal. I mean, that's an allusion to the 10 Commandments. Verse 5 tells us, also speaks of like the whole law and all the commandments by talking about executing judgment between a man and his neighbor. I mean, that's love thy neighbor as thyself. So we've got all the law and the prophets being sort of wrapped up in this. And it all focuses on that list of people in verse 6. The stranger, the fatherless, the widow, shedding innocent blood, which is where they're going to go to in the chapters that follow in Luke chapter 6, because they're going to kill the Lord. And they're going to walk after the other gods, and the other gods are themselves to their own hurt. But notice the widow again. Here we got chapter 19 referencing back to Luke chapter 19, referencing back to this section in Jeremiah, which mentions the widow. Now come back to Luke chapter 20 and look at the end of Luke 20. Because I appreciate that we haven't read Luke 20 before we sit down. We just plow straight into it, and you might not have Luke 20 in your mind. But come down to Luke chapter 20 and look how Luke 20 ends. Verse 45. Then in the audience of all the people, he said unto his disciples. Now remember, all of these things are taking place in the temple. In the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these. And here he says, beware of the scribes, which desire to walk in long robes and love greetings in the market, and the high seats in the synagogues, and the chief rooms at feasts, which devour widows' houses, and for a show make long prayers. The same shall receive greater damnation. So here, what we've got essentially is in chapter 19, he takes us back at the end of 19 to a chapter in Jeremiah that talks about how we're supposed to behave, and it's not oppressing the widows. And then he's going to end chapter 20 coming back to this behavior of devouring widows. And so you can see the den of robbers, in a sense, if we can use that theme, the den of robbers is there in chapter 19 and comes back at the end of chapter 20 with this devouring widows' houses. And again, it's their houses. And yet the focus all in those two chapters that we looked at is it's my house, the house that's called by my name, my house, which is a house of prayer for all people. And when you think about where we're building up to in the life of Jesus Christ, we see the culmination of what a temple and a house for God truly looks like. And he's paved all this, he's created this paved way that we might, come to truly appreciate what is being presented to us in the last 4 chapters of this gospel, as we would call it. So if you're in Luke chapter 20 now, just come back to the beginning, and I'll just suggest to you that we can see a structure to the events that are presented here in this chapter. So if you're looking at the screen there, what I've done is I've taken the section where we were just at, my house is a house of prayer, where he comes into the temple. And if you look at the structure of this chapter, shall we say, or this section, it is establishing Christ as the Son of the Highest, and how that comes about. And you'll notice that it's his house, it's the house of God. Then you have in chapter 20, verses 1 to 8, this question about authority. They want to know, by whose authority do you do these things, and who gave you this authority? And then he talks about, well, can you answer John? this question about John, and they are like, well, no. But essentially, the answer to where is Christ's authority was in the answer that they weren't willing to give about John's, which is that it was heavenly. And then you've got the vineyard, the parable of the vineyard, and the servants who are supposed to look after the vineyard. And then it says, well, we'll send the heir. This is Luke 20, verses 9 through 16, that he'll send the heir and that they'll reverence my son. And yet they don't reverence the son. They seek to slay him. And yet this is the beloved son. Then in chapter 20 and verses 17, 18, you'll see it talks about the stone which the builders rejected, which is again a reference to Christ in establishing his role as the Christ. He's the stone which the builders have rejected is now become the head of the corner. And so we've got him as we're the chief cornerstone. Then in Luke chapter 20 and verses 19 through 26, you've got that whole do we pay tribute? And again, Jesus' answer is, well, whose image is on the coin? And rendering unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and rendering unto God the things that are God's. Then he comes back to Abraham, a reference to Abraham with the Sadducees who don't believe in the resurrection. And I think that helps to give us even more clarity as to the transition of this chapter, because why deal with this now, this question about resurrection? And again, we could just see it as a chronological event, or we can see it as deliberate moving forward of the argument and the direction that Luke wants to take Theophilus and us. But again, you've got that whole, whose wife is she in the resurrection? And then the answer is, well, they neither marry nor are given in marriage. And then there's a reference to Abraham and how he's not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. And then the chapter has this question about, well, how is Christ David's son when David refers to him as Lord? And so you've got all these seemingly unconnected events. I guess in a very simplistic way, what I want to show you is if you look at the green box on the screen here, that sort of encompasses the first, there's 7 events there. And isn't that lovely? We've got a sort of a perfect structure. But it's interesting that, I've been saying to you that Luke likes his 4s. Now this is a complicated 4, and I'm happy for you to think, well, might be a long bow. Because we would expect a 4 as being 4 and 4 is 8. That's what you've been taught, where I'm teaching you tonight 4 plus 4 is 7. And you're thinking, well, that doesn't add up, brother. But if you look at the green box, one of the commonalities, and it's probably most clearly stated to us, is in this parable of the vineyard, is about the death of the son. If we go back to that section of the parable, so Luke 20 verse 9, you'll see that parable as it plays out leaves us with a dead son. Verse 14, come, let us kill him that the inheritance may be ours. So they cast him out of the vineyard and killed him. Now there's no statement in that parable that the son is resurrected. So that first, I would suggest to you that first collection of 4 focuses around Christ's death and the events that lead to it and build to it. And so you have the rejection of his authority. They won't accept his authority, although it be heavenly. And you think of how it worked out for John. And so we've got this sort of section that focuses, or a set of 4 that focuses around death. And yet the transition there in verse 17 and 18 is that the stone which the builders rejected, which speaks of death, then become the head of the corner, resurrection. And then what you see is the events that follow in this purple box. So, as it were, the second four, or, if we were going to split it there in verse 17, focuses around the resurrection, most clearly stated in the discussion about the resurrection and with the Sadducees, starting verse 27. But that he's the God of the living, not the dead. So the first sort of half of the chapter, if you will, broadly speaking, leaves us with death, with rejection, with questions about authority, with a house that should be a house of prayer, but is a den of thieves. And then the second half of the chapter, if you will, leaves us with the head of a corner, God's image, which is the intention from the creation, with the God of the living, the God of Abraham. And then you've got David's son, and he's David's son, but he's not David's son. It's God's son that's being spoken of. He's David's Lord, which makes him God's son, which is only true if you have him being exalted to sit on the as it were on the right hand. Now, I'm not suggesting he isn't God's son, but you see the Son of Man, as it were, and the Son of God. I hope I've made that clear enough. And so, yes, you've got 7 events, but essentially within that middle section here, you've got an overlap that takes us from death to life. So, trying to move on here. And so, all what we see is all live. He's a God of the living, for all live unto him. And that is the intention, that we should live unto him. Now, it's worth noting that, again, the threads keep, coming in and out and popping up, that this idea that all live unto him is going to get picked up again in the next chapter. Now, if you just come down to Luke chapter 21, you'll notice that, again, he's in the temple, he's in the treasury, and he's watching how people, this is Luke 21, verses 1 to 4, how people are casting in, and then he sees a certain poor widow. And again, you get the widow mentioned again. So they devour widows' houses in verse 47, and then essentially 2 verses later, he's back to focusing on widows. And he's saying, I haven't finished with this widow, with this focus on widows. And he's saying, a certain poor widow was casting in 2 mites. And he said, of a truth, I say unto you, that this poor widow hath cast in more than they all. For all they have of their abundance cast in unto the offerings of God. But she of her penury hath cast in all the living that she had. Now, the focus that I've picked up here is on the living. She's put in all her living, as it says in Luke 20, verse 38, that all live unto him. But we've noticed that there's another connection there with devouring widows' houses, and right after it, we've got widows. The other connection here is the penury. Because in the chapter we're talking about, the previous chapter, chapter 20, you'll notice that he was asked the question about, do we pay tribute unto Caesar, back in verse 22. And then what's his response? Show me a penny. And so it's interesting that we've got this idea continuing into the next chapter, in chapter 21, about this idea of whose image we are. So if you were to take the whole thought that's contained in Luke chapter 21, verses 1 to 4, it sort of compresses almost all of chapter 20 into 4 verses. Like, this would be the summation of all of the chapter we're looking at, because with this poor widow, you have the links to the house of prayer, because that's where we are. We have the offerings that are being offered. She's in there casting into the treasury. She's joined herself to the Lord. You've got the contrast to those people who think that they're living unto the Lord, but living unto themselves. You've got the image, whose image and circumcision are we? You've got the questions about resurrection, because she obviously believes that if she casts in all that she has, all her living, that will be resurrected. And yes, we're talking about a monetary thing, but that's the confidence that the widow has, is that what she casts in, what she sacrifices to the Lord, into the offerings of God, that offering will be resurrected, because that is the hope of all the faithful, is that our offerings, whether it be our firstborn in what Abraham was asked to offer, or whether it be our 2 cents, will be resurrected, and that more abundantly. And so I put to you that Luke chapter 21, verses 1 to 4, you could say is this like concentrated, it's the concentrated version of Luke chapter 20, if you will. It's the big summation of the message of chapter 20. And so, you get through all this, and then you hit chapter 21 with this poor widow, and it just brings all of these thoughts like flooding to us. Can we come over to Romans chapter 14? Romans 14. And we'll come down to verse 7. So in Romans 14, and again, we could read much more of Romans than we are tonight. But in Romans 14, come down to verse 7. For none of us live to himself. No man dieth to himself. And do you see there's that idea of life and death? For whether we live unto the Lord. And whether we die unto the Lord. Whether we live therefore or die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ both died, first half of this chapter, and rose, second half of the chapter, that he might be Lord. And again, this probably helps us to understand the question of how is Christ David's son when he calls him Lord, that he might be Lord both of the dead and of the living. And so Romans 14, I think, in these verses 7 to 9, gives us the spiritual lessons. So if we go back one slide, Luke 21 verses 1 to 4 is sort of very practical. It's very real. This is the real. When this woman cast in those 2 coins, that's the rubber meeting the road. That's, I don't know what other cliches you want to put there, the brass tacks, as it were. This is it. Where in Romans 14, you've got, as it were, the big, theoretical concept that we live and we die to the Lord, that he might be the Lord of both the dead and the living, that it all live unto him. And that's demonstrated by that widow. It's demonstrated in the sacrifices of the broken and contrite heart that's developed in the friend of God, in Theophilus. So I hope that sort of makes sense as far as, trying to tease out I know we haven't been boring down into Luke chapter 20. It's been mostly very overviewy. Can you come back to Luke chapter 20 then? And we'll go back to this stone which the builders rejected, because we got a couple of passages taken here out of the Psalms which are worth considering in the time that we've got left here. So coming back to Luke chapter 20, and come down to verses 17 and 18. Now, we're not told here to go looking in the psalm. It doesn't say it is. Oh, yes, it does. Sorry, verse 17. What is it then that is written? The stone which the builders rejected. And so we're told, go back and read this passage. Now, it's taken out of Psalm 118. And if we were to go back and look at Psalm 118 and look at it in its entirety, it's a very powerful psalm in the context of what we're talking about. It's the psalm that leads us to the crucifixion. And so we've got this psalm. Now, the thing that's interesting is it also has its connection in the triumphant entry, which was just prior to this in chapter 19. So you'll see in the two quotes there in Psalm 118, verse 22, the stone which the builders have rejected, the same has become the head of the corner. If we would read down a little further in verse 26, it says, blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. Psalm 118, verse 26 is comparable to Luke chapter 19, verse 38, which was prophesied in Luke 13, verse 35, or spoken of. And so, again, when we go back and look at that psalm has a whole bunch more in it that speaks to us of the events that we're looking at. Let's just go back to Psalm 118, sorry, and just look at some of the verses that are sitting around that. I think we've got a little bit of time tucked up our sleeve here. So the psalm begins in verse 1 with, oh, give thanks unto the Lord, for he is good, for his mercy endureth forever. And then you'll see that repetition, for his mercy endureth forever, is just punctuated, in the verses that follow. Talks about the house of Aaron, they that fear the Lord, call upon him in distress. The Lord is on my side, I will not fear what man can do to me. The Lord taketh my part with them that help me. Therefore shall I see my desire upon them that hate me. It is better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in man. It's better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in princes. Now, this is where things are going to go in Luke following chapter 20. The questions about where does our confidence lie? You think of the chapter that is on offer for next session, Luke chapter 20, is when the nations are all discombobulated, that men's hearts are failing them for fear. And it's worth thinking about these words by contrast to what we're going to get in the following chapter. Verse 14, the Lord is my strength and my song, he's become my salvation. The voice of rejoicing and salvation is in the tabernacles of the righteous. The right hand of the Lord doeth valiantly. The right hand of the Lord is exalted. The right hand of the Lord doeth valiantly. And think about that concept as it relates to the Lord Jesus Christ, that this idea of the right hand. And I just want to put that out there for you to think about. And then verse 18, verse 7, verse 18, the Lord hath chastened me sore, but he hath not given me over to death. Open to me the gates of righteousness, and I will go into them. I will praise the Lord. This gate of the Lord into which the righteous shall enter. Now, this is talking about that house again. And it's got those allusions to the glory of the Lord returning. Remember, we had that reference to the gate. And so you've got a whole lot of stuff going on in this psalm that, again, has its fulfillment in the things that are going to be played out shortly in Luke's gospel. It's probably worth just leaving with verse 27. God is the Lord which hath showed us light, binding the sacrifice with cords, even unto the horns of the altar. This psalm then takes us to the crucifixion, which is where we're headed, obviously, from now on into in Luke's gospel. We need to keep moving. you don't need to turn to it because it's familiar to us. Galatians 3 verses 26 to 29. You've got there on the screen. For ye are all the children of God by faith in Christ Jesus. For as many of you as have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ. And if you be Christ, then ye are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. So this idea of what makes us children of God is faith plus our connection with Christ in baptism. And this brings us back to this idea of Abraham. And this is what I guess Theophilus is getting, better educated in, is that what does that actually look like to be a child of God, and by contrast, what it's not. And so he's bringing us to this idea. Now, baptism is a type of death and a resurrection, but it doesn't stop with a baptism. We are planted in the likeness of his death, that we might walk in the likeness of his resurrection. So we need to remember that although Theophilus was baptized, just like we have been baptized, that's not the end of our walk. That's, as it were, you remember our breakdown of Luke chapter 20, the first half of it we said associated with death, and the second half of it associated with resurrection. The same is true with our life. Baptism is a death, but then there's this section of our life that is supposed to be demonstrated in a resurrected Lord who lives in us, for all live unto him. And so, this is, again, part of that journey that Theophilus is on, and we're sort of tagging along for the ride, is to understand that we, although baptized into Christ and have put on Christ, what makes us Abraham's seed is he's the God of the living, not the dead. This is a living thing in our lives, demonstrated in a life that is lived. I mean, maybe that's probably the simplest thing. We could probably have done all of this, what we just spent the last hour talking about, and just had summarized the whole chapter and saying that what we're trying to be brought to is that it's a life lived. And so Abraham is that example of a person who lived a life of faith and became the friend of God. And that's what Theophilus is being encouraged in. I don't think we have time to develop this, but I'll just sow this seed. What's interesting, if you go back to Luke chapter 20 and you look at the parable that's presented there about sending servants into the vineyard and them beating some and despitefully entreating others, it's interesting that it makes a point to say, and he sent a third. When you compare this to Matthew and Mark's gospel, I think it's Matthew who says he sent two and then his son. I might have this back to front. And then Mark says essentially he sent several. It says, and they beating some and stoning some. And there's this sort of nebulous amount. We don't really know how many, but it seems to be more than three, more than a few. Where Luke's gospel is deliberate. It says, and he sent three. And then the fourth, which again I think plays into his pattern of fours. He says he sent three, and then the fourth is the son, the heir. But it's worth considering that if you go back and look at Numbers chapter 12, verse 7, 2 Samuel 7, verse 5, and Isaiah 44, verse 28, you have three servants who are declared to be the servants of God, whose job it was to build a house. And again, this house essentially was the tabernacle or the temple. The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these. And it's interesting that we've got 3 servants who came to them for the purpose of building a house for the Lord. And so that's something that we can go away and look at. There's a lot in those sections. So by all means, read all of chapter 12 of Numbers, all of 2 Samuel 7, and all of Isaiah 44. Probably the passage that summarizes all of that for us, because we're really out of time, is you'll notice that Paul will pick up on these ideas in Hebrews, and he talks about, I'll just reference them and you can recall them in mind, but Hebrews 1-3 would be worth a read as well. He talks about God sending, he spoke in diverse manners by unto the fathers by the prophets. Now he's spoken to us by a son, which again has this allusion to the parable. It talks about who was in being in the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person. You get the reference to the coin there, whose image and superscription is this. And then he compares him to angels, and he says, "Thou art my son; this day have I begotten thee." And again, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son, which has a connection to this 2 Samuel. Remember, he says, "For he will be my son, and I will, if he sins, I will chastise him." Hebrews 2 talks about him taking on not the nature of angels, but the seed of Abraham. That's Hebrews 2:16. And then in Hebrews 3, verses 5-6, in reference to Moses, it says, "And Moses verily was faithful in all his house as a servant for a testimony of those things which were to be spoken after. But Christ is a son over his own house. Whose house are we if we hold fast the confidence and rejoicing of the hope firm unto the end?" So, if you look at that first 3 chapters of Hebrews, it summarizes very much this parable about, sending servants and seeking something from them and then killing the heir. Okay. We'll close with this one because I think it's worth answering. If we can just conclude with looking at this idea of how does David then call him Lord? It's a reference to Psalm 110. So we'll go to Psalm 110 and then we'll call it a night, if that's all right. Psalm 110. And when you get to verse 1, we'd go, yep, we found our verse and we're done. The Psalm of David, "The Lord said unto my Lord, sit thou at my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool." And this is quoted here in Luke chapter 20. And Jesus puts this question to him. And we're never really given an answer as to, well, how then does he call him Lord? Now, we got a hint to the passage we looked at prior that he might be in Romans chapter 14, that he might be Lord of both the dead and the living. I think if we read down to verse 4, we would get their answer, or they would have got their answer. And you see it there at the bottom of the screen. "For the Lord hath sworn and will not repent. Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." And the reason I wanted us to come back to this idea is where we started it was a house of prayer for all people, but it became a den of robbers. And when we looked at the passages there, that house of prayer for all people was on offer to the stranger who joined himself, like the Levite, to the Lord. But we said, well, that's not possible, because you couldn't join in that sense and become a Levite. It was something that was by birth. We are here in the psalm that we come back to in this chapter towards the end of Luke chapter 20, essentially the end of Luke chapter 20. We're drawn to Psalm 110, which talks about a different priestly line, a priestly line which a stranger could be joined to, because we hope to be kings and priests at Christ's coming. And we can't be kings and priests after the order of the Levite. And so here we've got, again, this connection to a whole range of thoughts. This priest after the order of Melchizedek, whom Abraham gave tithes. And so I think again, when we go and look at the wider pictures of what's going on, hopefully you can see that there's some connections there. I think that we probably could have used more time or less fluffing about on my part. So I apologize if we haven't developed those ideas clearly enough tonight, but I hope I've given you plenty of food for thought. And then when you go back and look at Luke chapter 20, you'll see that there is a flow of thought and a connection between those events, and developing in us this idea of what house are we, and what temple should we be for our Lord, and after what priesthood should we be. So thank you very much.